All right, I'm going to have you pull out the little fill-in-the-blanks portion of your bulletin there. If you'd like to read in one of the Bibles under the seat in front of you, I'll be in Luke chapter 15 on page 874. It's the parable of the prodigal son, but I want to set this up a little bit, and this is such a familiar passage that I'm going to challenge you to read, follow along, listen actively rather than passively this morning. And to do that, I want to give you a couple questions to ask of the text as I read it. And these are questions, by the way, that you can bring to any passage in the Bible. I know often we'll open our Bibles during our devotional times, or we open our Bible and try to read because the pastor at church says we should be reading our Bibles, and we're just kind of overwhelmed by it all. But if we just kind of simplify it and focus it in on these two questions, what do we learn about God from this passage? And what do we learn about us as human beings from this passage? The Bible has something to say about one or both of those things on every page. And this is what the Bible's really all about, isn't it? And so as I read this passage, I'm going to make this a little bit more specific. I'm going to encourage you to answer these two questions in a single word. So as we look at this passage, we're going to learn that God is fill in the blank. And as I read it, I want you to think of the word you would put in that blank. And as we read the passage, we as human beings are fill in the blank. The passage is a story about a father and a son in an ancient Palestinian village. But the father, as most of us know, stands for God, and the son stands for us and a response, a relationship with God. And so I'm going to dig in and start reading now with these two questions in mind here in Luke chapter 15, starting with verse 11, where Jesus tells a parable. He says, "There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs." He's a good Jewish boy, by the way. "And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, when he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and he came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him." Remember, the father stands for God, okay? "And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead, and he is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." What a passage. The truths of this text just jump right out at us at one level, as we've seen with so many of our passages in Luke's gospel. A sermon on this passage is almost unnecessary. But I think you'll appreciate some of the stuff we have to share this morning as it illuminates the passage. Before we jump into that, though, again, I wanted you to read through this with me actively. So let me hear what you came up with. God is. What do we learn from this passage about God is? God is what? God is what? Gracious, I heard. Forgiving, I heard. Love. Merciful. Patient. Kind. Excellent. Yeah, it's right there, isn't it? What about us? Not so good, right? Willful. Selfish. Short-sighted. Stupid. Foolish. Yeah. Mad. Yeah, in one interpretation of the word mad, I would agree. Crazy, right? He will be. All right. Okay, so this is what we see from this passage, okay? And so I want you to look on your outlines, and we're going to dig in a little bit deeper and find out what we learn about us. We're going to back into this thing and talk about what we learn about us from this passage first, what we learn about God secondly. What we learn about us, folks, as we go through this passage, it looks like we're dealing with pretty familiar stuff. Basic, immature, foolish, stupid, adolescent rebellion, doesn't it? This guy squanders his inheritance, and Joanne and I inherited the house we live in Hermosa Beach, as most of you know, when I was about 32 years old. By that time, I had become a Christian. I was married. We were expecting our first kid, so I was at least somewhat mature and responsible. Just how mature, we won't go there. But mature enough to hang on to this house for all it was worth and not do anything stupid so that we still have it today. Contrast that with a buddy of mine who inherited a house in Hermosa with his brother, not when he was 38 years old, but when he was 20 years old. And he and I both back then were smoking pot and partying and doing all this stuff. He blew through half of that house money, hundreds of thousands of dollars in a year and a half. Gone. And when we read this passage, that's what we kind of sense is going on. And what I want to help us see today is that there is way more than that going on. That we, illustrated by the son's behavior, are much worse than we think. We are much worse than we think. In the final analysis, this passage is not a passage that's simply telling us about what a son foolishly did with his inheritance, his stupidity, his immaturity. That is there. But the main point of this passage, where the son is concerned, is what he did to his father, his ingratitude, his disrespect, that made a fool of his father in the eyes of the village community. Now, to appreciate that, I want to take you into the world of the social scientists. Social scientists talk about something called cultural scripts that we use to kind of make sense of life together. And I'm going to give you a definition, kind of a theoretical definition, and I'm going to give you an illustration that will perfectly clarify this for us this morning, okay? Here's a definition. This is what cultural scripts are all about. They are mutually, we all know them, tacitly, we don't have to say anything about them or write them down, shared assumptions about how things are supposed to work in human relationships. It's these cultural scripts that we know to be true about how we are to interact with each other that help us make sense of life. Now, if that's a little abstract, let me give you just a classic example. Newcomers take their place at the end of the line. This is one of our cultural scripts in Western society, okay? So when I go to Vaughn's and load up my little basket or my big cart, I know better than to go to the line, bypass everybody in line, and go up right behind the person who's being helped and stand there, right? I'm smart enough, I hope, to look for the shortest line, but I get at the back of the line. And that's because of a cultural script that's not written down anywhere. We all just tacitly agree that's how life works. And you say, well, duh, of course it does. Well, no, not of course. Of course it works in our culture. It doesn't work that way in every culture. Casey Schramm, many of you know Mark and Casey, who are longtime members of our church. Casey worked at Disneyland and was in charge of the lines that form at the ticket sales and elsewhere, when everybody's waiting to get into Disneyland. And for the most part, newcomers stood at the end of the line. But every once in a while, there would be a bus of people from a very different culture. In this case, a nation on the Pacific Rim, an Asian nation. And the bus would be full of people who had not been properly socialized by their tour guide to understand what our cultural scripts are here in the West. And the older people would get off that tour bus and walk right to the front of the line, because in their culture, there's a different cultural script. Namely, honor-shame culture, older people go right to the front of the line. And when we have collisions in cultural scripts like that, we all get really kind of uptight about it, don't we? And some of us get mad, depending if we have that justice gene going on, Well, all that to say that there are cultural scripts going on behind the scenes in first century Palestine that, just like the rule that newcomers go to the end of the line, they're never written down. we have to read between the lines and read a lot of ancient literature and background to understand these things that are going on behind the scenes in Scripture. Another thing very interesting about this stuff is that when Jesus tells parables, he often will cruise along and with commonplace stuff, and then he'll throw in behavior that completely contradicts the expectations of the cultural scripts of the people that he's addressing. Think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. When the Samaritan comes along and helps this Jew, it's like, oh, that wouldn't happen. Okay? And it's at those points when the cultural scripts are compromised and betrayed that the reader or the listener, in the case of Jesus' audience in first century Palestine, this is where Jesus intends to get our attention. Just like somebody gets our attention who cuts in line at Vaughn's, when Jesus all of a sudden tells us and shows us somebody doing something weird, we were supposed to stop and say, oh, wow, there's a lesson here. Now, to understand how this impacts our passage, what we need to do is go back and walk you through what some of the expectations would be so you can appreciate where they are contradicted in the behavior of the Son, and especially in the behavior of the Father as he responds to his Son's anomalous request. So here's some crucial cultural scripts that are going on. We'll explain them along the way. Some of them are self-explanatory. Property in the ancient world is not inherited or distributed until after a father's death. This is still the case today in rural Mediterranean society. I'll introduce you later to a tour guide who's a missionary and a New Testament scholar who spent 30 years in ancient villages in the Mediterranean world where not much has changed since the time of Jesus. And this is the first thing we need to understand. Property is not inherited or distributed until after a father's death. The second is that discussions about inheritance are always initiated by the father, never the son. And we'll see why that is in a minute. And we'll see what happens when this cultural script is ignored, as it is in our passage here today. Thirdly, family crises are everybody's business. And this is probably the hardest thing for those of us who live in the West to understand today. In my neighborhood, I don't know most of my neighbors. It may be the case with you as well. You may be more of a single family kind of neighborhood, but we're in townhouse condoville down there in Hermosa Beach now. And this hit home one day, and I've shared this story when I went out and I saw across the street on the sidewalk all these boxes, these moving boxes and stuff, and I saw this guy come out. So I went over to introduce myself to my new neighbor. I said, how you doing? I'm your new neighbor, And he goes, oh, we've been here for a year. We're moving out. Say what? Well, this guy, think about it. He did drive his car in, down under his condo, and would walk up in his condo. And, I'd never see him. I'd probably see his car drive back and forth on the street. Now, there are numbers of our neighbors we do know pretty well. We have a dear family across the street that their son makes bank whenever Joanna and I go out of town by taking care of my cat, so he's very dear to me, okay? But, and there are other neighbors that we know. But even the neighbors we know and know us don't know the dirt on the Hellermans. So that if I was a coke addict or something, or Joanna and I were in marriage counseling and our marriage was falling apart, nobody on Cypress Street would know anything about that. And they certainly, even if they found out, I certainly wouldn't be publicly shamed and disgraced in the community because of what was going on in my family. Totally the opposite of first century Palestine, a little rural village, these little rural agrarian villages where everybody knows all the dirt on everybody. And most importantly, where the families, especially the father, because he's the point man, the father's honor is on the line in every family crisis and every family debacle and every interaction with the public. This is an honor-shame culture, and this is a huge, huge deal. So what's happening in this passage, here's a real window into what's happening in this passage, is the son is not just squandering his inheritance, he is utterly disgracing his father by even asking for his inheritance to begin with. And there's a fellow named Sirach who's a Jew writing a few years before the time of Jesus. And here's what he says. He says, it's a disgrace to be the father of an undisciplined son. It's a disgrace to be the father of an undisciplined. I read that as a Westerner and I think, oh, this father feels ashamed or disgraced. No. in a group culture, what's being talked about, it is a public disgrace. This father is publicly disgraced by being the father of an undisciplined son. And whether the father says, yes, you can have the inheritance and lets the son take it, or whether he says no, and in this culture, as we'll see, he beats him, disowns him, sends him from the house for even asking, everybody's going to find out that this has been going down as this story unfolds. Now, to what degree has this son disgraced his father? To what degree has he dishonored his father? To what degree do we as human beings dishonor God with our behavior toward God apart from the intervention of Jesus in our lives? Well, it's pretty profound, and I want to introduce you to this tour guide I mentioned a little bit earlier. His name's Kenneth Bailey. And Kenneth Bailey is a New Testament scholar who also spent the better part of 30 years as a missionary in the Middle East, Sudan, Syria, going through these little Middle Eastern villages, doing ethnographic studies about what their cultural scripts were, how people operate. And so he asked about this son's request for his inheritance. And here's what he writes. Bailey writes, he says, for over 15 years, I've been asking people of all walks of life, from Morocco to Egypt and from Turkey to Sudan, about the implications of a son's request for his inheritance while his father is still living. The answer, Bailey says, has almost always been emphatically the same. Has anybody ever made such a request in your village? Never. See, right at the gate with this request, one of these cultural scripts, these mutually and tacitly assumed realities about life has been betrayed. And so the people who are hearing Jesus teach us, and he says the son asks for his inheritance, are going to stand back and go, wow, what's going to happen now? See, bam, this is a attention getter. Could anybody ever make such a request? Impossible. If anybody ever did, what would happen? What is the cultural expectation for the father's response? His father would beat him, of course. He would beat him, of course. It's not what happens in the story, is it? Again, another example of Jesus trying to get our attention. And here's the kicker, folks. Why? This request means that he wants his father to die. This request means that he wants his father to die. Folks, we are a lot worse than we think we are. There are, Bailey writes of two exceptions to this first question, this never answer here. One of them was a fellow who came up to his pastor after a church service in one of these rural villages and said to his pastor, he totally distressed, said, my son wants me to die. And his pastor probed a little bit and discovered that the son had broached the question of his inheritance. And the only other instance where any son ever asked this question of his father, it was in a little town in Syria, and Bailey writes that his father, in his great anger, his father drove him from his house and disowned him for even asking for the inheritance. So, by way of summary, the son's great offense was not what he did with his inheritance, squandering the money. That's certainly there. He was certainly a fool. But the great offense was what he did to his father. The great offense was what he did relationally to his father. Again, it's a disgrace to be the father of an undisciplined son. And look what it says in Deuteronomy. Cursed is the man who dishonors his father and mother. Again, in a culture like this, cursed is the man, what this means is, who publicly dishonors his mother and father, and the idea of the broader village community. So here we are. What do we learn from us about this passage? Well, we learn we're much worse than we think. To summarize what we learn about us from this passage is we learn that we wish that God were dead. Wow. God, give me my inheritance. God, give me your stuff. God, let me enjoy this wonderful world you created and all the nice things and people in it. As for you, God, just get out of my life because I wish you were dead. Now, that sounds way over the top, doesn't it? And that's a reaction I sometimes get when I teach this in various academic settings and this and that. That sounds way over the top. But I don't think it is. First of all, because as I think we've seen, the cultural background totally explains that this is exactly the implications of the son's request to his father. But perhaps more to the point, the ensuing history shows us this is exactly the issue, that not only do we as a human race wish God was dead apart from divine intervention in our lives, that when God one and only time showed up in person to show us how much he loved us, we made sure he was dead. We hung him on a Roman cross. We want your stuff, Jesus. Think about the Gospels. We want your stuff. We like it when you heal us and make us well. We like it when you feed us and make us full. We want your stuff, Jesus. We want that inheritance, but we really don't want you, so we're going to be done with you, and we're going to hang you on a Roman cross. And that's exactly what we did when God showed up to say, I love you. So, yes, we are much worse than we think. And some of you maybe your backs and necks might be stiffening as you sit in your seats, and understandably so. Even as I preach the sermon and go through this material, frankly, this grates against my godless sensibilities that so often surface. That I want to believe the cultural message that I hear again and again, that human beings are basically good, but the Bible teaches otherwise, doesn't it? The Bible teaches that all our righteous deeds are like filthy rags, Old Testament, and that we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, New Testament. And I have to wonder, why is this message about human beings so hard for us to hear? I think one of the reasons is we are part of a culture that has been socialized with this self-esteem nonsense now for over almost 2 generations. This you're okay, I'm okay. We've heard it in our educational system. We hear it again and again in the media. And it's somehow deep down inside, we don't want to embrace the reality that we're not okay. Here's a great irony as I reflect on this stuff. Do you know we've had more encouragement to believe we're okay in the last 30 years in Western society than any culture in world history's ever had. Why is it we have a greater crisis with hopelessness, anxiety, depression, and suicide among our young people than we've ever had before, if we've had all this great teaching? I'm not saying there's a causal relationship between self-esteem teaching and the self-loathing that's going on among our young people, but what I'm saying is, all the self-esteem teaching in the world, all this drivel we've heard has done nothing to insulate us from the onslaughts of social media, culture, the other things that have just hammered down our young people and convinced them that they are not okay. So this is the picture that we have here. You know, I'm an educator, and there are people who we hear again and again that, the key is just education. If we just educate people, we just educate people and raise the knowledge base, the goodness of humanity will surface and everything will be okay. And, again, I'm coming to you as one who spent 50 years on one side or the other of a college lectern. I am all about education. Education, a secular education, does wonderful things to raise the socioeconomic level of the people that graduate from these colleges. I'm fine with that. But, folks, education does nothing for the moral and spiritual nature of the human race. And this was never driven home to me clearer than when John Hutchison's and I, we were on the Israel trip and visited the Holocaust Museum over in Jerusalem. And I'm walking through this thing, and I got to this one room where the pictures of all the Nazi leaders were up there, all the SS leaders, and then they had their academic credentials. PhD, MD, MS, PhD, on and on it went. It's the most highly educated people in the world at the time, perpetrating one of the most heinous crimes in human history. I had a lady go out the door this morning, and she said this, and it certainly applies to education as education relates to morality and spirituality. She said, you know what BS means? And she didn't say it. I go, yeah. And she said, well, MS means more of the same, and PhD means piled higher and deeper. And folks, where our spirituality and our morality is concerned, nothing could be truer than that. Nothing could be truer than that. So how do we personalize this? How do we bring this down? Well, what does this mean to you and me that we're much worse than we think? Well, something like this, I think. It means if I look around, folks, and I compare myself with others and think I'm a pretty good person, then I am deluded. I am deluded and blind to the reality of my moral and spiritual condition apart from Jesus. Brandon made a comment a couple of weeks ago that just spot on. He said, the more I walk with the Lord, the more I'm sensitive to just how bad I am. And that's true. That's true. We don't have a chance to get to the older son in this story. Those of you who know the story know when he was all mad because he didn't rebel and his father, didn't give him a fatted calf. And I think some of us are like that older son. We stop in our spiritual lives. We get kind of proud that we're better than others, and we don't allow the Holy Spirit to continually remind us how bad we really are, apart from divine intervention. But that apart from divine intervention is huge, because the good news is, if on the other hand, I am generally disappointed with myself and feel that I could never measure up to God's standards because I can't even measure up to my own standards, then I'm not far from the kingdom of God and I'm ready for the good news. And that, folks, is what we learn about God from this passage. And it is amazing. It is just amazing. God, we discover, again, when we get behind the scenes and understand a little bit about culture in the ancient world, God, we discover, is way better than we can even imagine. God is way better than we can even imagine. Let's start with the father's reaction to the son's request. The son says, give me the share of property that's coming to me. Now again, remember, family crises are everybody's business. If the father does the normal thing and refuses to give the kid's inheritance and beats him or disowns him, like we saw in those examples, those from modern-day rural Palestine. If the father does that, the whole village is going to know, but at least the father will save face, see? If the father gives him his inheritance, the father's going to make a public fool of himself. And that's exactly what he does. He gives him that inheritance. I shared before about a fellow in our college group years ago named Afsar, who was Islam, and he converted to Christianity. And his dad, who was a Muslim, first tried to kill him with a butcher knife, couldn't bring himself to do that, so he disowned him. He no longer had a son for the better part of 2 decades. And the reason is because of the public dishonor. Because of Afsar's conversion from Islam to Christianity, here in the States, his father was shamed publicly in the little Pakistani village, his home village back in Pakistan, because word got out. And so here's this father. He's got a chance. It's going to be bad enough seen that he's going to be disgraced having an undisciplined son who would even ask, but he can save face by beating his son, disowning him. But what does he do? He gives him his inheritance. Now, what does this tell us about God? Well, I'll read between the lines a little bit and tell you kind of what I think at this point. I think the message here is that God will let us go our own way and make our own destructive choices and reap the consequences, even if it makes God look like a fool. Even if it makes God look like a fool. And I think he does this because God loves us too much to make us love him. God's love is a non-coercive love. He wants us to love him freely. And he's willing to let us go our own way and blow our inheritance, so to speak, even if it makes him a fool in order for us to come to our senses. Now, God will not be made to be the fool forever, folks. There will be a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory, to the honor, the public recognition of God the Father. But during this season of salvation history, when God is calling you and I into his arms, the degree to which God has humiliated and continues to humiliate himself, the gospel's foolishness to those who are perishing, in order to woo us into his arms, is just remarkable. Just remarkable. And it gets even better. Let's pick up and look at verse 17 and following again there on the outline. When the young man came to himself, he says, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish with hunger? I will arise, go to my father. I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. And so here comes the son down the road to the village. here comes the son down the road to the village. And to appreciate how this story is going to unfold, a couple more of these cultural scripts here. In a traditional agrarian village, a father does not readily forgive a rebellious son. To do so would be to dishonor himself in the eyes of the village community. Now, in our culture, one of my kids rebelled and finally came to their senses and wanted to come back, and I knew they were sincere. Oh, my goodness. Who wouldn't throw their arms around their kid and welcome them back? There's a lot more at stake in a situation like this. Here this kid is coming. Imagine the whole scene, The women are hanging out in the village, it's daytime, and they're in their homes, or they're doing their thing. Most of the men are out working in the fields, and the road goes out, and whenever anybody's coming to one of these little villages, everybody's, oh, hey, somebody's coming, and it's like, and pretty soon they see who it is. Oh, it's so-and-so's son. It's John's son. Oh, what's going to happen? What's John going to do? Well, the kid knows exactly what the cultural expectations are. He knows what the father's going to do, doesn't he? The father's going to act as if he's not his son at all. He's going to no longer treat him as a son, and he's going to treat him as a stranger and maybe hire him as one of his servants. His son gets it, totally understands the cultural expectation. But of course, what happens, as he arises and comes to his father, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Wow. The rebellious son dishonors his father. The solution, well, he's not my son. I might hire him as a servant. No, that's not what happens. Bam. This father receives him back. And these people are hearing Jesus tell this parable. Their heads are spinning. But we're not done yet. We have one more little cultural script to bring a little more color to this and help you appreciate just how much better God is than we think he is. Men do not run in public. To do so would be to humiliate oneself before the other men in the village. We know this from text after text in the ancient world. I'll just give you a few. Aristotle, great men never run in public. Great men never. I had an Armenian student. I was teaching this stuff in a class at Biola. I had an Armenian student named Vace, big giant guy. He was a lineman for UCLA, He's like this, He's just the biggest heart. And Vace, very traditional Armenian background, he said, Joe, we have a proverb. There's an Armenian proverb that reads like this: an important man doesn't need to run, men run to him. Okay? This is very, very common stuff. There's a philosopher named Chillin. I like that name because he's always chilling, right? Bad, I know. He says, let no one see you in a hurry. Here's our Jewish friend we saw before, who's writing a generation or two before Jesus. He says, a man's manner of walking tells you what he is. Okay? Bailey, our tour guide, tells this story. He says there was a church that was without a pastor, and they're candidating this pastor. This guy's interviewing to be the pastor. And they were all ready to hire him. He's a good preacher. He seemed to be real compassionate. His family was in order. Just a good choice for a pastor. But the deacons' elder board, they voted not to hire him. And the reason they gave the church was he walks too fast. I'd be dead. I'm hyper. I'm always on the move. Not in this culture. And think about it. There are reasons for that. Look at how these people dressed. Now I want you to think. Folks, about the humility the father was willing to go to receive this son back. About this man in the village who pulls up his tunic and in front of the eyes of the village, runs to meet his rebellious son who he should have disowned and receives him into his arms to say, I love you. Folks, this is Jesus' picture of the willingness of God to be utterly humiliated in order to reach each and every one of us. And I want you to think about this public humiliation thing. As Jesus is teaching this, he's going to the cross. In Philippians chapter 2, it talks about Jesus humbling himself by being obedient to the point of death. Probably better translated, allowed himself to be publicly humiliated by being obedient to the point of death. And then Paul writes, even death on a cross. Because crucifixion was public humiliation and status degradation at its extreme in the ancient world. And this is the degree God has gone according to this parable and the history that follows, to say, I love you, and to bring us home. It's just remarkable. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him. While Joe was still a long way off, his father saw him. While Cheryl was still a long way off, her father saw her and ran and embraced her and kissed her and said, welcome home. Let's throw a party. Welcome home. Let's throw a party. So we learn something about us, don't we? We're a lot worse than we think. We're not simply stupid and foolish. We wish God were dead. But we learn something about our God too, don't we? God is way better than we imagine. God is way better than we imagine. The sin of the Son, rebellion, stupidity, yes. The love of the Father, forgiving, of course. The sin of the Son, wow, way worse than we think, huh? The love of the Father, God's way better than we think, isn't he? So how do we respond to this? Well, our takeaway here this morning is, first of all, I think we need to come to grips with this reality of the dilemma of humanity apart from divine intervention. And again, this is hard to hear, but the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And the beginning of this son's restoration to his father's home was when he came to his senses. When he came to his senses, we need to admit it. We need to own it. We need to confess it, that we are way worse than we think we are. This son was ready to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Apart from Christ's intervention in your life, can you stand before God and say, I have sinned against you, God. I've sinned against heaven and earth. I am not worthy to be called your son. Folks, that is the beginning of a relationship with the God of the universe. That's the first step home. And then secondly, take away, hey, come home and join the party. Come home and join the party. Some of us are out there living in that pigsty, feeding the pigs, and life isn't really good. And I think for every one of us here today, there's a degree to which we need to come home and rejoin the party. I mean, just being out the onslaught of the world for a week and then coming to church and getting recalibrated, we need to come back and join the party, don't we? And be reminded of what God has done for us. Others here, maybe this is the first time you've heard this story. We call this story the gospel. That means good news. Good news. It's good news to understand who we really are and own it. It's even better news. It's the best news to understand the extent of God's love. That if God will forgive those who killed his son and repented and got right with him, there's nothing you have ever done that God will not forgive, and he will welcome you into his home. He will put on his robe of righteousness, and you will spend eternity with God, starting not when you die, but today. Folks, that's the gospel. That's good news. Let's pray.